A new tracking method has been deployed against Chrome users over the last several months, and it has not been widely reported because the companies responsible for it are sophisticated enough to roll it out quietly. The method bypasses the tracking protections that Chrome users might think they have. It operates below the level that extension-based blockers can reliably interdict. It produces data that is as useful for ad targeting as the cookie-based tracking it supplements. And for Chrome users specifically, because of the specific design decisions Google has made in Chrome's tracking protection features, the method is particularly effective. I want to walk you through what the method is, how it works, why it affects Chrome users specifically more than users of other browsers, and what the practical options are if you are using Chrome and you find yourself uncomfortable with this development. The method I am talking about is, in general terms, server-side tracking via first-party domains and cross-domain state sharing that operates below the browser's cookie management layer. The specific implementations vary, but the general pattern is as follows. Advertising networks and tracking companies have, over the last few years, shifted away from reliance on third-party cookies, which browsers increasingly block. The replacements include several techniques. One is first-party cookies that are set by the websites you visit and then shared with the tracking company through server-side APIs that do not involve the browser at all. Another is cross-domain state sharing via server-to-server communication, in which websites you visit send identifying information about you to central tracking services that correlate your activity across sites. Another is advanced fingerprinting, which combines many signals to identify you without needing to set any cookies at all. Another is K-name cloaking, in which tracking domains are disguised as first-party subdomains of the site you are visiting. So, that browser-based tracking protections do not recognize them as tracking infrastructure. These techniques are not new individually. What has changed in the last year is that they have been integrated into cohesive systems that work together, and the systems have been deployed across large portions of the advertising ecosystem. The fragmentation that existed previously, in which different trackers use different methods and could be blocked individually, has been replaced by more unified approaches that are harder to block because blocking one component does not stop the others. For Chrome users specifically, the effectiveness of these methods is amplified by Chrome's specific design choices. Chrome's Privacy Sandbox, Google's alternative to third-party cookies, is designed to enable advertising while reducing reliance on the specific third-party cookie mechanism. The Privacy Sandbox APIs themselves can be used for tracking in ways that users may not fully understand. The sandbox includes features like Topics, which reveals your interest to advertisers, and Protected Audience, which allows advertisers to target audiences based on your browsing behavior. These features are described as privacy-preserving, and they are relative to the third-party cookies they replace. But they still enable tracking, and the tracking is specifically authorized by the sandbox design rather than being blocked by it. Chrome's tracking prevention features, while present, are less aggressive than those in Firefox, Brave, or LibreWolf. Chrome does not, by default, block first-party tracking that operates through server-side APIs. Chrome does not, by default, block advanced fingerprinting. Chrome does not, by default, enforce strict cookie partitioning in the way that stricter browsers do. Chrome users, even with the default tracking protections on, are more exposed to modern tracking methods than users of the stricter browsers. This is not a bug in Chrome. It is a design decision. Chrome's business model ultimately rests on Google's advertising revenue. A browser that blocks advertising effectively would undermine that business. Chrome's tracking protections have been calibrated to reduce the most egregious forms of tracking, while allowing the forms of tracking that Google's advertising business depends on. The calibration is rational from Google's perspective. It is unfavorable to users who would prefer a browser that simply blocks as much tracking as possible. The practical consequence is that Chrome users in 2026 are exposed to tracking methods that users of competing browsers are significantly more protected against. The exposure is not catastrophic in isolation, but over time, and across the many sites that the typical user visits, the data that flows to tracking networks from a Chrome user's activity is substantial. The data is used for ad targeting, for audience segmentation, for cross-site profile building, and for sale to data brokers who aggregate it with data from other sources. What can a Chrome user do about this? The most effective option, by a large margin, is to switch browsers. I have covered this in detail in other videos, but the short version is that Firefox, Brave, and LibreWolf all have tracking protections that are more effective than Chrome's against the methods I described. Firefox with uBlock Origin blocks most of the common tracking vectors. Brave blocks aggressively by default. LibreWolf blocks the most of any mainstream browser. Any of these is a meaningful upgrade over Chrome's defaults. If switching browsers is not an option for specific reasons, there are mitigations that can be applied within Chrome itself. The first is installing uBlock Origin, which is the most capable content blocker available as an extension. uBlock Origin uses filter lists maintained by privacy communities, and the lists are updated regularly to address new tracking methods as they are discovered. The protection is not as complete as what stricter browsers offer natively, but it is substantially better than nothing. The second mitigation is configuring Chrome's cookie and tracking settings. Under Settings, Privacy and Security, Cookies, you can block third-party cookies. This does not block all of the tracking methods I described, but it does block some of them. Under Privacy and Security, Tracking Protection, you can enable additional protections if they are available in your version of Chrome. The specific toggles vary by version and by region due to regulatory variations. The third mitigation is disabling the Privacy Sandbox features. Under Settings, Privacy and Security, Ad Privacy, you can turn off the Topics API, the Protected Audience, and the Ad Measurement features. These are enabled by default in Chrome, and each represents a specific tracking channel that the browser authorizes. Turning them off does not block the other tracking methods, but it closes specific channels that would otherwise be open. The fourth mitigation is using a secondary privacy-focused extension for cases where uBlock Origin does not cover the gap. DuckDuckGo Privacy Essentials, Privacy Badger, and Canvas Blocker are examples. The specific combination that works best depends on your browsing patterns and the sites you visit most. These mitigations, applied in combination, can make Chrome a meaningfully less leaky browser than it is in its default configuration. But the mitigations do not fully close the gap between Chrome and the stricter alternatives. For users who care about tracking, the switch to a different browser remains the higher value option. The broader pattern I want to highlight is the arms race dynamic between tracking networks and tracking prevention. As browsers have added protections against the tracking methods of previous years, the tracking networks have developed new methods that bypass the protections. The new methods tend to be more sophisticated, more difficult to detect, and more difficult to block. The arms race has not been a level playing field. Tracking networks have substantial commercial incentive to develop new methods. Privacy communities, which develop the blocking tools, are mostly volunteer-driven and resource-constrained. Over time, the gap has tended to widen rather than narrow. Chrome's role in this arms race is notable. As the browser with the largest market share, Chrome's tracking protection choices effectively set the norm for what tracking is considered acceptable in the industry. Chrome's relatively permissive approach has allowed tracking networks to develop and deploy methods that, if Chrome had been stricter, would have been blocked at the browser level and would have had much less commercial traction. Chrome's market position, in other words, has been a tailwind for the tracking industry. The competing browsers, by taking stricter approaches, have created pressure in the opposite direction. Firefox, Brave, and LibreWolf collectively represent a population of users for whom tracking does not work as well as it does for Chrome users. The tracking networks are aware of this and, in some cases, adapt their practices to the stricter browsers. But the economics of tracking depend on scale, and Chrome's scale means that tracking that works on Chrome is commercially viable, even if it fails on the stricter browsers. The practical implication for users is that browser choice is a privacy choice. The browser you use determines, in substantial part, how much data is collected about you by the sites you visit. Chrome, as a commercial product of the largest advertising company in the world, has made choices that favor the advertising business. Firefox, as a product of a nonprofit, has made different choices. Brave, as a product that differentiates itself on privacy, has made different choices. LibreWolf, as a community-driven, privacy-first project, has made yet different choices. Choosing Chrome means accepting Chrome's choices. For users who are comfortable with those choices, that is fine. For users who are not, the options exist, the migration is not difficult, and the privacy benefits are real. Subscribe for the next video, which covers the specific filter lists and configurations that maximize protection against the tracking. Methods I described, regardless of which browser you use. The techniques transfer across browsers, and knowing them makes you more capable of defending your own activity, whatever your primary browser happens to be. And in the comments, tell me whether you have noticed the increase in tracking methods that I described. I find that users who pay attention to their browsing experience often notice that ads are following them more persistently than they used to, and the observation lines up with the deployment of the new methods.